Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I know there's probably going to be some people joining a little bit late, but that's fine. But we're on quite a tight schedule today with only just an hour. So I think it'd be good to crack on. I'll just start with a brief bit of housekeeping and introductions. The session today is 1 hour. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Zoom webinar function, but unfortunately, you can see us and we can't see you, which is probably the wrong way around, but I'm afraid that's the way the functionality works. We're going to do some kind of brief information provision. We'll do a quick update on and a reminder on what the ARB proposals were, what the consultation results and what the feedback from the profession and others who responded to the consultation were. We'll briefly talk about next steps and then plenty of time for a question and answers. Hopefully you've all had instructions on how to submit the questions. We've had some in advance, but I think there's some functionality to submit questions. And so we'll be monitoring those. So my name is Hugh Simpson. I'm the Chief Executive and Registrar of the Architects Registration Board. And I have with me three of my colleagues, Simon Howard, the Director of Standards, who's responsible for the policy around continuing professional development, and Rebecca Roberts-Hughes, Director of Policy and Communications, who's been in the lead in terms of the consultation itself and can provide and will be providing some overview of what the responses are. Also in the background, we have Finn Tabine from our policy and comms team, who's going to be managing the technology, we hope, and will be driving the slides. Don't worry, there aren't loads of slides, but obviously in a system like this or a situation like this, it's really important to make sure everyone has the correct information. So perhaps to start with, Finn, could I just ask you to share the slides, and I will give a kind of brief overview and a reminder of what the ARB's proposals were to start with. Hopefully that should all be on your screen now. So just as a kind of, again, as a brief introduction, we held the consultation from September 2022 to January 2023. And we had a huge response. I think the statistics are kind of later on in the consultation, but our largest ever consultation response with over 1,000 responses. So really, really positive. And I just want to thank everyone who's responded. I know a lot of the people on this webinar did, so really appreciate that. If we move on to the next slide, Finn, and then the one after, headline principle. So hopefully this will be a reasonably familiar, but at the start of the consultation, we set out that we tried to design a CPD framework which would meet each of these principles, and there was general support. And I think it's probably important to acknowledge that with these kind of principles, some of them are hard to object to, so avoiding duplication. However, I think hopefully what will come through and what you'll see is that the principles have actually genuinely tried to shape the type of scheme we've been proposing. So the most popular principle was avoiding duplication. And I think without wanting to do too much of a spoiler alert, one of the big bits of discussion was about how we can make sure our scheme is complementary with the existing work of REBA. So we've done some work to make sure we can work in a complementary way with REBA, proportionate and deliverable, tailored by architects to their practice. And again, a really important element of our proposal was that architecture is a very diverse profession, and what we didn't want is a scheme that would feel as though it was designed around one type of or one part of the practice. So whether you're an architect in academia, whether you're in large commercial or residential, it should really feel like that you can tailor your CPD to your practice. And then finally, the least popular, but still with 81% support, was the idea of the scheme should try and shift overall competence. And again, I think it's really important to state that for most architects, you'll be doing CPD anyway. And what this is really hinting at is thinking more about the profession as a bell curve. So it might have a small but potentially significant increase in competence, and that relates also to some of the elements of the scheme, which we'll come on to talk about later in relation to kind of potential mandatory topics. Finn, can we move on to the next slide, please? So you remember for the consultation that there were a number of kind of key elements to the scheme. The first is a recommended minimum of 8 CPD activities. And I think it's important to emphasize that there was a lot of debate and discussion about should we mandate any number of activities? Should we be very specific? And I think what we found in terms of our pre-engagement was that people wanted some guidance and some clarity about the level of expectation. Flexibility and choice, really, again, another key component, and one that we've certainly taken on board from other professions who've already have a mandatory CPD or revalidation, is that it's really important that CPD activity should be tied to an individual architect's practice rather than trying to create a kind of generic process, and that it needs to suit learning styles and development needs. And so again, we'll talk about this a little bit more detail, but for some that might be taught courses, but for many it won't be. It'll be peer-to-peer discussion. It might be part of an organization's appraisal system. It has to be very flexible. Another area where we are set out in the proposals was that all professionals will reflect on their practice and will be continually thinking about what they did well, what they could improve upon, and reflection was a key part of that. And again, fundamental to trying to make CPD about outcomes, what people have learned, how they developed, rather than ticking a points box or an hours-based box. And that, again, finally, an underpinning element of the scheme is that the board was proposing that they may mandate CPD on a particular area of architecture, but architects will decide how to apply it to their practice. So again, the two areas that we gave as examples, I believe, were around climate change and sustainability and fire and life safety design. It's just two examples whereby it could be deemed as fundamental to confidence in the profession as a whole that that we would mandate a particular topic in a particular year, but that was part of the consultation. Finn, next slide, please. So hopefully everyone can see this slide, but tries to give a kind of sense of the process around the proposals, and that's that it would be for architects to carry out CPD every year, and I think really importantly confirmed that they've undertaken it as part of their annual renewal. I think again important to kind of state that actually it's an opportunity for the profession to state publicly and to the public more generally that they do carry out CPD, and it's part of what makes them a profession. As I say, no suggestion that there would be an absolute minimum number of activities or hours that an architect must complete, and that we wanted to make the CPD scheme so flexible that it could be directly relevant to anyone's practice, again taking into account the huge diversity of what architects do. There may be some core CPD topics mandated by ARB, as I mentioned before, but this would be very much communicated well in advance, and there'd be lots of guidance in terms of what that would mean. Again, if we move on to the wheel, as it were, CPD would be recorded on an ARB platform, which we've been developing behind the scenes, and kind of part of our attempts to improve the way in which our IT and our registration systems operate, and making it far more user-friendly for the profession. But also that if there were other compatible platforms that could be used, and again, explicitly, we've been working with REBA to make sure that that if you were to carry out CPD on the REBA system, that's what it would be compatible. So a really important part of our proposals originally. Again, as I referred to earlier, board was very clear that it felt that it's really important that at the heart of continuing professional development was not a process by which people would tick a box, attend a course, put down a number of hours around input measures, but could describe through a reflective element about what they've learned. And again, finally, within this, a real question about how do you do a system which is proportionate and which we can provide some assurance that people are actually doing the CPD, and the difference between a voluntary and a mandatory scheme. And again, the proposal was that we would select a proportion of CPD records on an annual basis, and that would enable us to review and assess potentially more on an aggregate level, the sort of things that we can learn, but also confirm that the system is working and that people are able to operate and everyone is doing their CPD. So that's a very, very brief overview of what we consulted on. I think we're going to move on to the next slide, and Rebecca's going to take you through the consultation results section.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Hugh. So hopefully everything you've heard so far is not news to you. These are the proposals that the board put together, which we published for consultation. But now we're going to tell you what you said about them, and then Simon will come up with what we are going to do about that. So if you could move on, please, Finn. So as Hugh has already hinted, we had the highest number of responses we have had yet to an ARB consultation at 1,350. So thank you to all of you for spreading the word and for taking the time to review the proposals and tell us what you thought about them. The majority of the responses were from registered architects, which is as expected. This scheme, of course, exclusively applies to registered architects. So we're really glad that so many of you heard about the news and shared your thoughts with us. 35% of registered architects who responded qualified over 21 years ago. You'll remember that we ran another survey the previous year on our principles, and 46% of respondents had qualified over 21 years ago then. And then 47% are self-employed or work in a small practice. Again, that's compared to 55% on the previous survey. So what that tells us is that we're reaching a wider range of professionals this time round. So more people have heard about the proposals and have taken the time to tell us what they think. So that's really good. The report that we publish will include all of this data and more, and it will have the full range of figures on all the different practice sizes and when people qualified. And it will also include demographic information on gender, ethnicity and location. On those points, the figures broadly reflect the makeup of the register, again, which is as expected given who this was aimed at. Finn, next slide, please. So we asked you, to what extent do you agree or disagree that recording activities is a good way of measuring CPD that has been undertaken? And the majority of respondents agreed with that proposal, 58% agreed with it. So following this and the positive response we had to our principles in last year's survey, we see this as telling us that architects agree with an outcomes-focused and activities-based scheme. We also asked, to what extent do you agree or disagree that it would be helpful for ARB to recommend a minimum number of activities? And in our draft guidance, we suggested 8 might be a number that we would suggest. 44% agreed with that, 15% neither agreed nor disagreed, and 40% disagreed. So we saw lower levels of agreement on that question around the minimum number than we did on the one on the screen about it being activities-based, but there was still agreement overall. So those were multiple choice questions that I've just talked through. We also invited written comments on some of our questions so that we could understand people's views and the rationale for the responses that they were given. We applied a simple but rigorous approach to qualitative research to read through all those responses and understand what you were telling us. So we read a cross-section of responses, we looked at the key topics that were raised, and then we used those topics as markers and we tracked them through all of the responses. And what that means is, firstly, that at least one member of ARB staff read every single one of those 1,350 responses. And the second thing it means is that the topics I'm about to talk through with you were raised by you. We didn't come to this consultation with a pre-conceived list of things that we wanted to track. We put that list together having read what you'd told us. So this is genuine feedback from people. Finn, next slide, please. So one of the open questions that we asked was whether you have any suggestions about topics that we should mandate. Of the 1,350 responses to the survey, 891 people answered that question, and that was 66% of all respondents. So 2/3 of you took the time to provide comments on that. 151 respondents, which is 11%, suggested that we shouldn't mandate anything at all. And 8% of respondents suggested that we should mandate precisely the same topics as REBA. But 55% of respondents gave consistent examples of key topics that ARB should mandate if we chose to do mandatory topics. So you can see the three most common ones on the screen there. These are changes and updates to regulations, sustainability and environmental issues, and then safety, including fire and life safety. And we've got some quotes there to give you an example of the sorts of things that people said. Other topics that were raised were technical topics, including product specification, ethical practice, and also equality, diversity, and inclusion. So those are topics that people thought should be mandated. Next slide, please, Finn. So another open question that we asked was around the reflective statement. So we asked, to what extent do you agree that a reflective statement should be an important part of the scheme? And this had both a multiple choice element and an open element, so you could give us the rationale for your response. The majority of respondents disagreed with our proposal to include a reflective statement. 22% neither agreed nor disagreed, and 16% of respondents agreed. When we looked at the comments that you've made to understand why people had made the suggestions that they had, 32% of respondents said that it was because it would be too bureaucratic for them. And you've got some quotes on the screen as an example of what people said. 18% said they had concerns about how long it would take. 8% said it would be beneficial and they could see the role for reflection within CPD. 5% said that they would like more guidance to help them complete a reflective statement. So they might have agreed with it in principle, but said, we want to know what that looks like and what it means. 4% of respondents suggested it was optional, so might have agreed with the idea of reflecting in principle, but suggested that writing a statement about it should be optional. And 4% had financial concerns. And then the last question we asked was, is there anything within the scheme that would have an impact on ARB's commitment to equality, diversity and inclusion, or have a positive or negative impact on anyone with particular protected characteristics? So 42% of respondents wrote something in response to that question, and that included, I don't have any concerns, so some people took the time to say that, or they might say other things such as the profession is overworked as it is. They might have raised other issues. But the most common points that were raised around equality, diversity and inclusion were first of all money. So 5% of respondents said that finances were a barrier to them completing CPD or complying with our scheme. 3% of respondents raised a concern around disability. So, for example, we've proposed an online recording system for your CPD, and people suggested that if they had eyesight problems, that might be hard for them to do, or that we'd have to make sure the portal was concise and clear for people with ADHD. And then caregiving responsibilities, including childcare, was raised by 2% of respondents as a reason that they felt unable to comply with the CPD scheme. So there's a lot of information that I've just gone through there. There'll be even more in the report. So the report we're going to publish this week, most likely tomorrow, goes into a lot more detail with more illustrative quotes, more of the topics, and more of our analysis of it as well. We have discussed these results and our analysis of them with the board, and now Simon's going to tell you the conclusions that the board reached after discussing these results and how we're finalising the CPD scheme as a result of that. Simon.
Thanks, Rebecca. Afternoon, everyone. Finn, could you go on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the conclusions that we've reached from the consultation, our proposals, and really importantly, the next steps that we're going to take. So it'll come no surprise to you after the consultation responses that we are going to introduce an outcomes-focused CPD scheme that's based on activities rather than CPD points or hours or anything like that. And it'll be one that allows architects to carry out CPD that is relevant to their practice and learn in a way and train in a way that's relevant to them. It doesn't have to be formal CPD. It can be any manner of different CPD activities. We're not going to mandate a minimum number of activities, though we will recommend 8, as we say, just to give people a framework around kind of their expectations. And although generally speaking, architects will be able to carry out CPD that's in an area that's relevant to their practice, we are proposing to introduce, to start off with, mandatory topics in relation to sustainability, and in relation to fire and life safety. Now, we already publish competence guidelines in relation to both of these 2 areas, and it's our proposal to update those and certainly to signpost architects to learning resources that will help them carry out CPD in relation to those 2 areas. It may well be in future that we have different areas or no areas at all, but we think, based on the feedback we've received, that would cover the things that architects think they need to learn about, including taking into account that part of the consultation there was a real desire to know more about regulations. Well, in actual fact, a key part of new regulations will be covered within fire and life safety design, and also within sustainability. We've taken a long time to consider the feedback we've had in relation to the reflective statements, not just looking at the quantum of what people said, but the reasons they've said it. And we maintain that it's a really important part of an outcomes-based model to have some elements of reflection, as opposed to just somebody saying, I've carried out my activity, ... and that then therefore complies. So it is our proposal that we need to have a reflective statement that's maintained, but we also need to reflect on the fact that there's a really high level of misunderstanding about the importance, the ease, and the value that a reflective statement can offer architects. So we know we need to do a lot more work in terms of guidance, templates, examples of how a reflective statement can work, and how it doesn't have to be a bureaucratic burden. And then finally, and this will come as a pleasure to a lot of architects, I know, we are working closely with our colleagues at the RIBA, who've already got an excellent CPD scheme. So RIBA members who are carrying out the CPD scheme and remain compliant with the RIBA can record it on the RIBA platform, and that will be if they're compliant with the RIBA requirements, they will also be required compliant with ARB requirements. I think, do you want to go on to the next slide, because these are some of the myths that we need to bust. We know we need to communicate a lot better, and there's a great deal of misunderstanding about CPD and the scheme that we know that we're going to need to address. And see, these are some of the key things that people have said to us in relation to ARB delivering CPD or accrediting other people to do it, how we will use their data. And so, for example, some people were concerned that that anything they submit as part of their CPD record could be used as part of a disciplinary case, and that would absolutely not be the case. We need to do more explanation about what CPD actually is, and it doesn't just involve reading books or going on training courses. And also a lot of feedback, particularly from older architects, in respect of, well, I'm very experienced, I'm only working part-time, I don't need to do CPD. And we know we need to address those questions as well. But first of all, if you're fully retired, you don't need to be registered. And secondly, people are carrying out architecture part-time. Certainly their clients wouldn't expect them to be part competent, so we need to address those as well. So very quickly, just turning, I think, do you want to put on the last slide, please? Just to talk about where we're at the moment. So we're currently carrying out a pilot, so we're getting some really important feedback from some of you, in fact, who've offered to pilot this scheme, so we can make improvements, particularly in relation to what guidance we need to provide people, and then we'll be auditing that. As Hugh mentioned, we're developing a portal at the moment, so we all know that this scheme will stand or fall on the capability of the IT to make it work. So we're going to be wanting to test that, and then we'll be publishing at the end of this year our guidance in respect to the scheme and what CPD people will need to do, with a view to this scheme being launched in 2024, and then becoming mandatory as part of an obligation for you to be able to register from 2025. It'll be architects will have to confirm that they've recorded their CPD as the scheme requires. That's it in terms of next steps. As Rebecca says, we'll be publishing a consultation report in the next coming days, and I think it's back to Hugh.
Thanks very much, Simon. I actually think we're about to sort of broadly go into next steps, and Finn and questions. Finn, have you got the questions there? Do you want to just start by posing some really easy ones for me?
Yeah, so thank you, I suppose, to start off with, to everybody who sent in questions already. We do have Q&A in this webinar as well. So again, if you've had any questions arising from the presentations, or indeed any of the responses we give to the questions that have already been sent in, do feel free to submit them there. But yes, to start with, we've got one here from Andy. Andy says one size most definitely does not fit all. How will the new scheme be tailored to meet the needs of the huge breadth of architects that practice and use their skills in many different ways? So Hugh, can I maybe ask you to deal with that one?
Yeah, thanks, Finn. I mean, I guess there's a couple of things. Simon's already covered some of this. I think one of the myths is that we need to make sure that that in our communications and our guidance, we're clear that CPD can take many, many different forms. I think there's a tradition that people associate CPDs with formal courses or points-based courses or things, and they may be part of that. But actually, the most fundamental thing is that if you are learning in any kind of environment, that is continuing professional development. So again, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, whether you're in heritage, whether you're in residential, whether you're work for a large firm, anything which means that you're thinking about and reflecting on your practice. It could be reading a magazine article, a news article. It may be reading Building Magazine, might be looking up the latest advice from government on the building regulations. All of those things count. So we're trying to move away from an idea that it's a compliance thing. You tick that box and you've done it, to you actually sit within your practice and go, well, actually, I had a conversation with a client this morning, and actually that's CPD, and I'm just going to write that down because that reflection is really important. So that's at the heart of our proposals, is making sure that we build on what people do, and we don't try and force people down a kind of box of collecting hours or collecting points. So I hope that answers the question, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. So we have another question here from Charles. He's sort of talking about the Building Safety Act and duty holders, competency levels. So given that we're proposing building safety as a mandatory topic, how does that relate to the Building Safety Act and duty holders? Simon, is that one maybe you could deal with?
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, it absolutely relates. People, you know, there are new competence frameworks being developed all the time. Certainly in relation to principal designer, the RIBA have recently developed one, and I know the industry is also creating a competence framework in relation to the role of designer under the Building Safety Act. So certainly, people who've carried out work in relation to that can use that as demonstration that they've worked on, and CPD. I mean, generally speaking, being a good professional and carrying out CPD will only engender confidence in the profession, not just in relation to building safety, but the kind of confidence, you know, that to give, for example, professional indemnity insurers assurance that they're dealing with, you know, responsible professionals. So, yeah.
Thank you. There's an interesting one here that I think is for Rebecca, but there's a question from Dee. Who now will speak for the architects? So, Rebecca, do you want to deal with that one?
Yeah, that is an interesting one. Well, of course, it's not ARB. ARB doesn't speak on behalf of architects. We are the regulator of the profession, and we exist to protect the public. So everything that we do is looking at the amount of skill that architects need in order to be able to design great buildings and environments that will work for society and for the people that need to use them. That said, of course, we do want to hear from architects for two really important reasons. One being that if we're introducing something like a CPD scheme for architects, we want to know that it'll work for you. So we want to hear from you. That's why we've consulted on this. And then, of course, the other reason is that you're the subject matter experts when it comes to architectural practice. So there's expertise we don't have as regulators. And that's why it's been really useful to hear from all of you that these are the mandatory topics that you would recommend. You know, you've told us which topics you think are affecting your profession right now. And then we developed some guidance based on those. So yeah, I think that's how I would phrase that question. And then, of course, there are professional institutes that probably do speak for you. I won't speak on behalf of RIBA and the other professional bodies across the nations, but membership bodies have a different function to ARB.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a question here. So I think you sort of touched on this already, Simon. So this might be an opportunity for you to elaborate on something that came up in the myth busting. And there's a question here from Eleonora. So why do I have to spend money on CPD when I don't practice and I'm registered just for the title? In my home country, I simply declare I am not practicing, keep paying the annual fee, and that's it. So Simon, do you want to discuss that one?
Yeah, there's quite a lot to unpack there. So first of all, as a matter of principle, if you're not practicing, you don't need to be on the register. The use of the title architect only bites in relation to business or practice. So if you're not practicing, you're not using the title, you don't need to be registered, and therefore, obviously, you're not bound by any of our rules or regulations. But secondly, and I touched on this in myth busting. It's wrong to think that CPD only has to be trained formal courses that you have to buy. There's any number of CPD activities that you can carry out that are free, and I think it's our job to explain that to the profession a bit better.
Thank you. So I think we're just going to deal with one of the live ones here that's come in, just because I think it's relevant to you as well, Simon, while we have you on the line. It's a question from Helen Taylor. So Helen asks, will practices be able to see summary information for their employees? Example, whether or not they are up to date on their CPD records, whether or not they have completed mandatory topics, or will we have to ask them for evidence?
Short answer is no. The information an architect submits will be confidential between them and us. So if it needs to be shared with a third party, it would be down to the architect themselves to share it.
And just while we're sort of on that subject, there's a question from Dagmar, which I think also relates. So Dagmar has asked, how will practices be held accountable for delivering good quality training in their offices?
Am I taking that one as well? So we don't regulate practices. We only regulate individual architects. So I mean, there are obligations under the code of conduct for every architect to ensure that their office is run properly and they've got the right resources, including staff. And imagine this would be part of it. But ultimately, we can't hold practices per se to account because we don't have regulatory oversight over them, only individuals.
Brilliant, thank you. So Hugh, I'm going to come to you next, and this one isn't a question, it's just a comment, but it's sort of an opportunity maybe for you to offer some assurances. This is from Mark. No question, just hoping to hear a light touch and flexible approach. And you're on mute.
Yeah, I'd spotted that just in time. Yeah, light touch and flexible. I mean, I guess the one thing is sometimes light touch is seen as pejorative and as negative. And I think what we're trying, and hopefully what comes across, is we're trying to build on what people are doing, and we're trying to build on good practice. We're trying to build on what most people would understand to be development. And I think moving away from preconceived views about what CPD is. I think the other thing, and it relates to a couple of questions I've seen in the Q&A, but I've not been fast enough to type responses to, which is it's a new scheme. We've consulted, we're piloting, we'll be reflecting in the first year of operation. And then undoubtedly, we will consider making changes to that. And I think one of the questions also in the Q&A was, how do we stop this scheme becoming starting off as relatively light touch, proportionate and growing? And I think that's a very fair challenge. I think I can't really answer that specifically, other than the fact that the board, to whom I am accountable to, have made it perfectly clear that they absolutely do not want a scheme which becomes bureaucratic and provides false assurance to the public, so that by virtue of the fact that everyone's doing lots of stuff, that suddenly equates in a mythical way to providing a greater public protection. So the board's principles are what they hold me and the team to, and the principles are clearly around proportionality. But that doesn't mean we won't change the scheme, either in relation to the numbers of topics or what mandatory topics. And again, a question that Adrian Dobson asked from Adrian from REBA asked is, will we consult on what those mandatory topics are in future? And the answer is absolutely, we will. This has to be a scheme that works to the benefit of the profession as well as the public, because that's really what we're about. So a good question and good challenge, but that's why we've got principles, so we can be held to account.
Yes, we might actually, just to bring up Adrian's question there. So when will more detail on the mandatory elements likely become available to architects? Just wondering, Rebecca, do you also want to come in on that one?
Yeah, so in answer to the first question on consultation, I think this consultation is how we have determined the mandatory topics, and it's not the first time those two have come up. We heard them in our previous survey as well, so we won't be reconsulting on that at this stage. And in terms of the detail, I think Simon covered this slightly in our next steps, but now the board has announced what it wants to do next, we have to go away and do that. So we will be finalising the scheme guidance. We'll be publishing it before the end of this year so that architects know what to expect next year. But in terms of sustainability and safety, the guidelines for architects that we published in 2021 will underpin our expectations of how architects will be doing CPD. So those guidelines are really there to help people understand what we think those topics mean, how they're relevant to practice, and then it will be up to architects to use them to affect their own practice. You've got such a different range of areas in which you all work. It's up to you to have a look at those guidelines and think about how best to bring them into effect for your area of practice.
Thank you. So there's a question here, and again, I'm going to come to Simon on this one, but Simon, there's a question from Martin. Who will monitor standards decided on, and how will we decide on subjects to be determined?
Sorry, can you say the first bit of the question again, Finn?
Sorry, yeah. So who will monitor standards decided on, and how will we decide on subjects to be determined? So I'm guessing that relates sort of to mandatory topics again.
Yeah, so certainly, so that's probably the same kind of answer I think it's going to be, that we will, there's actually a limited number of topics you could have as mandatory topics, given that the principle is that this should be able to apply to all architects. You know, there are limited numbers of generic topics, ethics, professionalism, fire safety, sustainability, and so on and so forth, that there could be, but we will consult with the profession and also with kind of other relevant stakeholders, governments, for example, if there are any regulatory changes that are required. In relation to who will monitor standards, I don't know if that's a tangential question about how will we audit and review the CPD that people have carried out. And that's something we haven't really touched on today, but there is a proposal. Our proposal is that we will take a selection of architects' CPD submissions and have them audited or reviewed by architects that we specifically appoint. In principle, to give feedback so they can improve, but also we need to retain that regulatory the regulatory option of saying, if somebody says they've done their CPD and they really haven't, and they haven't made the necessary attempt to do it, then we need to take regulatory action in respect of those people.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to come to Hugh in the next one. So Hugh, this is kind of a question about our education reforms. So will the changes in architect competence impact construction and legislative education in architecture courses? Will ARB be making mandatory changes in course accreditation?
Thanks, Finn. But I guess there's a number of things in there, and I guess that's the extent to which there's a direct link between initial education and training and the competence assessment there, and CPD, which is continuing professional development. And I think we would describe them as complementary rather than directly linked. Clearly, we've just concluded a consultation on reform to initial education training, the competence requirements of that, and there are lots of similarities. There is an emphasis within there around fire and life safety design and sustainability, but also professionalism and ethics, and the importance of continuing professional development is obviously fundamental to that, as it is within our code. So I think we would see those as I say, complementary rather than a kind of direct relationship. So this is CPD rather than, for example, continuing education and training, where if we'd gone down that route, there'd be more of a link to formal taught courses and formal learning rather than reflection and tailored to individual professional activities.
Thank you. So Rebecca, I'm going to come to you on the next one here, and it's again just about the consultation and the responses we got. But I don't know what percentage of registered architects are over 65, but you appear to not have given consideration to this section of the profession. Please prove me wrong. So Rebecca, if you can prove Stephen wrong.
Sounds like a good challenge. So we didn't ask people as part of the consultation their age. We did ask them how long they'd been registered, and 35% of consultation respondents registered over 21 years ago. So I think that tells us that we have heard from older people. The activity basis of the scheme is deliberately wide. So we're not specifying any particular type of activity. It's up to you whether you do something incredibly modern, like listen to a podcast, or whether you do something that involves a conversation with a peer, some sort of internal review, whether it's reading magazines. The point of this scheme is that it should suit different preferences and learning styles. However, if that question, it seems to me to be hinting at retirement age. So if it's a question around retirement and whether we've considered retired architects, then I'll repeat what Simon's already said, which is if you are fully retired, then you don't need to be on the register, and that means you don't have to pay your retention fee and you don't have to do CPD. You can still call yourself an architect socially. However, if you're doing any form of architectural practice, whether that's giving advice to friends and families or doing anything on a part-time basis, then as Simon has already said, you couldn't be partially competent. So we would expect people who are still working in some way to be competent and to be doing their CPD.
Super, thank you. So there's quite a few questions here that, I mean, I'll read out Isabel's that was submitted in advance. There's quite a few that also relate to the same topic. So will the CPD requirement be additional to the REBA's requirement, or can the same CPDs be registered for both? So again, we've questions being submitted live. There's one anonymous, there's one from Matthew here. So Hugh, can I maybe ask you to deal with that one?
It's funny. I thought you were going to go straight to Simon. So can you just?
I'm happy to take it. I'm happy to take
I think
it.
that might be one for you, Simon.
So the simple answer to the last question is you can. If you the CPD that you carry out for the RIBA, you don't need to do again. You don't need to submit again. You just need to tell us that's where you've recorded it, so we know that's where you recorded it. The only thing you would need to do is if you were one of the small percentage of architects chosen to be audited, to be reviewed, then you would need to be able to download your CPD record from the RIBA and upload it to us or send it to us. That would be the only administrative task you need to do. So the simple answer is if you're compliant with the RIBA scheme, then you'll be compliant with ours. But of course, we acknowledge the fact that we've got legal responsibility over all architects, but including those ones that aren't RIBA members.
Thank you. So we've had a couple of questions as well about the pilot scheme. There's one that's just come in here from Simon. So what percentage of registered architects will be participating in the pilot, and how will they be selected? So Simon, I might put Simon's question to you if that's okay.
Yeah, so everybody who responded to the consultation and said they were interested in learning more were contacted, and I think we have about 100 current pilotees on the scheme. We're always looking for more people who are interested, because we're just piloting one point at the moment. We will want to in due course pilot the actual portal as well to make sure that works. So anybody who's interested, then we've got plenty of capacity to work with you and get your feedback. It's a really important part of what we're doing.
So there's another question here, again from an anonymous attendee. What is the ARB doing to ensure that the introduction of a CPD program and extra requirements doesn't discourage new architects? For example, is any work being done to protect the job rather than just the title? So Hugh, can I maybe ask you to deal with that one?
Yeah, thanks, Finn. I mean, I guess it comes in two elements, and I guess the first I've kind of sort of answered in relation to the extent to which the requirements to do CPD would provide either a barrier or a disincentive to becoming a professional. And I'd certainly going around schools of architecture and visiting schools of architecture and speaking to students, I don't think they would see the requirement to keep up to date and to do CPD as a barrier to becoming and staying on the register. The question about protection of functions is a much broader question, and I think we could have a whole 2-hour seminar on that one. I guess the simple answer is protection of function is really a matter for government, because if they were to bring that in, that would be for the government to legislate and to say that they felt that protection of function was necessary to protect the public. And I think that is an ongoing debate. There was a consultation that the government held, I think, 12 to 18 months ago. So, and I know that it's a very live debate within the profession. And I guess that's the conversation that people often have, which is the extent to which there are things that only architects or a limited number of professionals should be done, and that should be listed within legislation. So I think both points are really good points, but I wouldn't see them as a direct link. The first one is, is there a disincentive to students doing CPD? I really hope not, and I don't think I've seen any evidence of that. And then the extent to which protectionist function is an important part of a regulatory framework, and that's really a matter for government. It doesn't exist in law at the moment, although we do realise that it does exist in part in different parts of the world. So it's a legitimate debate, an important debate.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a good question here from an anonymous attendee. It's just about the sort of like content of the scheme. I like the idea of starting with a PDP first before planning a CPD calendar for the year. Can it be organised with that option? And Simon, I see you nodding, so maybe you'd like to respond.
Yeah, so when we develop the portal, there will be a place for you to do a PDP. It's optional rather than mandatory, but certainly we've taken that feedback on board, and I agree it's a really important and useful tool. So the idea about this is that we provide as many tools and as much guidance as we possibly can so people can get value out of this. So yes.
Brilliant, thank you. Rebecca, I might come to you on the next one. And again, it's about the RIBA. Will there be an alignment with the RIBA's mandatory competence topics?
Yeah, thanks, Finn. That's a good question. So Adrian and Joni, I think, Adrian, you're on the line. We met in advance and talked this through. And I think we've agreed that RIBA has a more specific CPD scheme than ours, and anything that architects do for RIBAs would still count under ours, so you can still do activities on specific topics. What we've discussed with RIBA is that we will speak to them before we introduce any mandatory topics, and they expect them to be fully aligned with their list. So it would be hard for us to come up with something that's entirely new to the profession. However, if we did, through our research, through speaking to architects, through speaking to our sponsor department, for example, then we would have a chat with RIBA about that and see if that's possible. So there's definitely a will for the two of us to work together, but I would say it's highly unlikely for us to reinvent the wheel.
Brilliant. So there's a question here from Steve Eastland. So the scheme proposed is suited well to the profession. However, we often see this type of scheme become increasingly prescriptive and costly over time. Look at planning. So what safeguards are in place to ensure that this does not happen? So Hugh, can I maybe call on you just to offer some assurances to Steve?
Yeah, I think that's a very similar question to the one we talked a little bit about earlier, is that the board's been really clear. They couldn't have been clearer that they want a proportionate scheme. They don't want it to grow. And I think that's partly because of the underpinning methodology and the difference between an input-based scheme and an output-based scheme. An input-based scheme, there is, I think, a false reassurance that the more stuff one does, the more inputs you do, that's the greater reassurance. I don't think that's what the board's view, and I don't think it's my view or our view. I think the assurance comes from the fact that it's tailored to what an individual architect who's in the best position to understand what their development needs are. So unless the board comes back and changes the principles upon which they've developed the scheme, again, upon which they'd have to hold a statutory consultation, I think there's some reasonable reassurance. And again, that's not to say that we will get everything right all the time. There may be some elements of scheme that as a result of the piloting we realise don't work, or as a result of feedback either from individual architects or indeed from professional bodies or others that we think needs to be tweaked and changed. And again, we'll have a statutory duty to consult, so we would come back, but hopefully that's some reassurance.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a good question here from Dieter as well. So what is the process for auditing architect CPD records, and what feedback, advice or support will be provided by the ARB to those architects that are found to have fallen short of their requirements? Simon, can I maybe call on you for that one?
Yeah, thanks, Dieter. Good question. So in terms of auditing, so in the next few months, we will be recruiting a number of reviewers, auditors, not quite sure what they're going to be called yet, who are architects who've got the right competencies to review architects' records. And if we go back to the principle, one of the principles that Hugh showed at the very start is the idea of this scheme is to improve competence of the profession. It is not, the idea isn't to remove architects from the register. That's not going to be fulfilling our regulatory duty. So with that in mind, certainly the proposal would be to provide constructive feedback on, first of all, whether the CPD has met the requirements of the scheme, and if it hasn't, what needs to be done, or alternatively, if it has met but it could be improved there again. I think we would only get involved in some more in more severe action if an architect cannot or will not make the necessary changes to be compliant with the scheme. But certainly the idea is to provide feedback, a feedback loop, so they can improve the CPD in the future.
Thank you. So we had a few questions now that are sort of about the calendar for the scheme. So we've got one from John Paul saying, when will I be required to submit my activity records? And we've sort of got a complimentary one from Celia saying, would mandatory topics for the following year be released at certain dates in the year prior? So if you maybe want to take the first one, Simon, that might be one for you. When would somebody be required to submit their activity records?
Yeah, so we would expect people to carry out their activities, unsurprisingly, throughout the year, and they'll have a portal for them to upload those as they go along and develop as they go along. But certainly before, the idea is before you renew your registration at the end of the year, you will need to confirm that you've carried out your CPD, either with on the ARB scheme or on the RIBA scheme or any other compatible scheme that we agree to. So that will be the proposal. It's the end of the year that you must say, I have done it, but we certainly expect you to do it throughout the year rather than doing your homework at the last minute. In relation to the mandatory topics, we would give people good fair warning in relation to what's coming in relation to that. And as I say, it's not just going to be a bald, you must do some topics or X, Y, and Z. We'll provide lots of guidance and signpost people to where they can actually access the CPD material.
Thank you. So we're kind of coming towards the end here. We've just got a couple more questions. There's a good one from Matthew, though, that I think we should try and cover. So the RIBA CPD scheme is over-regulated. I would like to just do the ARB scheme, but will the RIBA accept the ARB scheme as compliant with RIBA requirements? So I'm not sure who would like to cover that one.
I think that's one for RIBA.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're not presenting today, but yeah, I'm sure they've taken note of that.
Yeah. I think we might be coming towards the end here. So Hugh, I might actually just pass over to you for maybe some final comments.
Thanks, Finn. I think, again, a very, very brief closing comment. I mean, I really hope that you found today's webinar useful. The feedback poll that's just popped up has been prescient. Please do fill it in. Again, just to really re-emphasize all the points we've made is that we want the scheme to be proportionate. We want it to be tailored to an architect's practice. We want it to work. And I think if we found that people felt the opposite of that, we'd want to reflect on that. But I think the consultation responses and the volume of that has given us a huge amount of confidence. With some qualifications, I think Rebecca has been really open about the fact that there's still a lot of work to do around that reflective element. I think there's clearly a lot of confusion. I think we're going to have to work really hard in the pilot to understand how can we improve the proposals and provide better guidance and explain that better. So like all good consultations, it's provided an opportunity not just for people to thank us for the work, but to really challenge us. And, we've got some reflection to do on that. So I'm really delighted and pleased that such large numbers of you have taken the time out of your day to come and not only listen, but provide some, great questions and some challenging questions, which I hope you feel as though we've made it a genuine and honest attempt to answer. There is the consultation report will be out, I think, day after tomorrow, Rebecca. So watch this space and please do continue to get involved and stay involved. So really just all it's left to me to do is, again, thank you once again for participating, and I hope to see you at another ARB event shortly.